If you like what I do, please consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't done so already, join the Patreon page, and purchase something from a Teespring store or Etsy shop. Every little bit helps. Thank you. On January 26, 1863, United States President Abraham Lincoln sat at his desk in the White House, troubled over the military situation that winter. The Army of the Potomac sat idle across the river from Fredericksburg, having endured a terrible defeat in early December. The Battle of Stones River in Tennessee that ended on January 2nd was a Union victory, but not enough to turn around the morale of the country. The attempt to take Vicksburg, Mississippi by way of Chickasaw Bayou ended in defeat. Desertions were up in all Union armies, and the Peace Democrats, also known as Copperheads, were riding high because of all these military misfortunes. That day, Lincoln wrote a letter to the man he hoped would turn around the fortunes of at least the Army of the Potomac, Joseph Hooker. In the letter he wrote, "I have placed you at the head of the Army of the Potomac. Of course I have done this upon what appear to me to be sufficient reasons, and yet I think it is best for you to know that there are some things in regard to which I am not quite satisfied with you. I believe you to be a brave and skillful soldier, which of course I like. I also believe you do not mix politics with your profession, in which you are right. You have confidence in yourself, which is a valuable, if not an indispensable quality. You are ambitious, which within reasonable limits does good rather than harm. But I think that during General Burnside's command of the army, you have taken counsel of your ambition and thwarted him as much as you could, in which you did a great wrong to the country and to a most meritorious and honorable brother officer. I have heard in such way as to believe it of your recently saying that both the army and the government needed a dictator. Of course it was not for this, but in spite of it, that I have given you the command. Only those generals who gain successes can set up dictators. What I now ask of you is military success, and I will risk the dictatorship. The government will support you to the utmost of its ability, which is neither more nor less than it has done and will do for all commanders. I much fear that the spirit which you have aided to infuse into the army, of criticizing their commander, and withholding confidence from him, will now turn upon you. I shall assist you as far as I can to put it down. Neither you nor Napoleon, if he were alive again, could get any good out of an army while such a spirit prevails in it. And now, beware of rashness. Beware of rashness, but with energy and sleepless vigilance go forward and give us victories. Yours very truly, A. Lincoln." With that reprimand and encouragement, Joseph Hooker took command of the Army of the Potomac, one of the principal armies of the United States during the Civil War. Hooker's past military feats and his ability to promote himself above others helped get himself that position. As one of his biographers wrote, Hooker's rise in the Army derived partly from his cultivation of the press, success in battle, reputation as a brave, aggressive general, popularity with his troops, and ability to command at the division level. Moreover, he looked like a general, 6 feet tall, well-proportioned, and handsome, with a rosy countenance, blond hair, and large gray-blue eyes. He sat erect on his white horse ahead of his troops. A correspondent said he appeared as the ideal soldier and leader. This ideal leader came from Massachusetts, as did his family 4 generations back. He was the 5th Joseph Hooker born into this family. The first arrived in Massachusetts just north of Salem from England in 1689. The family progressively worked their way west in the state until the 4th Joseph Hooker moved to the town of Hadley on the Connecticut River. The 4th Joseph Hooker and his wife Mary had 3 daughters by 1814, so when Mary became pregnant again, Joseph hoped for a boy to continue the family line and the family name. On November 13, 1814, Mary gave birth to a boy, whom Joseph readily named Joseph, becoming the 5th Joseph Hooker in this line. The elder Joseph Hooker owned a dry goods store, but the War of 1812 hurt him financially and eventually drove him out of business, forcing him to sell the home young Joseph was born in and move to Middle Street in a rented house. Young Joseph and his sisters would take odd jobs, with Joseph taking farm jobs offered by their neighbors. He would also collect floodwood from the banks of the Connecticut River for the family to use as fuel in their home. In his spare time, young Hooker would play a forerunner of baseball with the neighborhood boys called One Old Cat. Hooker was the catcher and, according to town lore, was excellent at it. crowding the plate so much that he caught the ball before the batter could even swing. This aggressive style of playing foreshadowed his later military career. His father was away from home a lot, driving cattle and other livestock, so Mary ran the household. She believed all of her children needed a good education, and as each one became old enough, she sent them to Hopkins Academy in Hadley. At first, the school was free, but it lost its endowment, so the Hooker children had to pay a tuition of $12 per year. Young Joseph paid his own tuition by earning money helping with wool spinning. At school, he excelled at public speaking. His voice was perfectly modulated for such success. His mother wanted him to join the ministry, but he didn't have much interest in that, even though he attended church and Sunday school regularly. His family had a long history of being in the military. His grandfather had fought in the American Revolution, reaching the rank of captain. According to one of his friends, he wasn't interested in either of those professions, even though he did study history and loved reading about military campaigns and the generals who commanded them. He wanted to study law ultimately. However, there was little money available for Hooker to go to college. Fortunately, one of Hooker's teachers saw the potential in the young man and lobbied on his behalf for his congressman to get Hooker an appointment to West Point Military Academy. At the age of 18 in June 1833, Hooker entered West Point. He took quickly to the regiment and was a hard studier, although not the brightest in class. He was known around town as the most beautiful cadet. He attended the academy with future Civil War generals John Sedgwick, Braxton Bragg, Jubal Early, John C. Pemberton, Arnold Elzey, and William H.T. Walker, among others. Even in the 1830s, the sectional divide over slavery made its way into discussions between the students at West Point. During a formal debate, Hooker argued against slavery, and after the debate, classmate Jubal Early kicked Hooker for his claims, attempting to draw Hooker into a fight, but Hooker decided against it. This isn't to say that Hooker was a perfect cadet. He was above average in his classes, but his demerits brought his standing down. He was written up for things like lack of proper respect for superiors and inattentiveness in class. Nevertheless, he graduated 29th in the class of 1837 out of a class of 50. Hooker was commissioned a second lieutenant in the 1st Artillery upon graduating, and by the end of October of that year, he was sent to Florida to fight the Seminoles, who were resisting being sent west of the Mississippi River during the Indian Removal Act's implementation. Hooker's first actions during his stint in Florida was to transfer supplies 200 miles to Fort Pierce, then to Fort Jupiter 40 miles further south. In March 1838, Hooker participated in an expedition into the Everglades to find and destroy a band of Seminoles and their camps. However, the Indians were elusive, and not much fighting took place. After that expedition, Hooker and the battery were sent to southeastern Tennessee to force the Cherokee out of their homelands. He didn't spend much time there before being sent to the Canadian border, specifically Vermont. Many Americans in this period were attempting to help the Canadians overthrow the government in England and thus violated the United States agreement with Great Britain. Hooker's occupation of the Canadian border was designed to stop the Americans from encouraging this overthrow. Another dispute on the Canadian border erupted about this time as well. Because the border between the United States and Canada was somewhat vague, the state of Maine and the province of New Brunswick vied for the virgin timber along the border, bringing into question where was the line and who had rights to the timber. Both sides' militias were called out and threatened to start a war. Trying not to start an international conflict, President Martin Van Buren sent General Winfield Scott to Maine to prevent any further hostilities from breaking out. Hooker, now a first lieutenant, was stationed at Hancock Barracks in Maine during this tense time. In July 1841, Hooker returned to West Point, but not as a student, but as an adjutant of the military academy on a 3-month stint. This position wouldn't get him a higher rank, at least not initially, but it would put him in influential circles with officers who could recommend him for promotion. It was staff work, but he did enjoy it. In October, he was back in Maine, but now he was made adjutant of the 1st Artillery. As tensions went down, the various batteries were spread out over New England, and Hooker, as adjutant, traveled over the region, preparing orders and making reports, keeping rosters and enlistment records, and carrying out administrative correspondence. An observer at Fort Adams at Newport, Rhode Island, described Hooker. It was about this time that Lieutenant Joe Hooker came to the fort on a visit. What a handsome fellow he was! Tall, straight, wavy light hair, blue eyes, and a complexion a woman would envy. Polished in manner, the perfection of grace in every movement, and with all the courtesy of manner we attribute to the old-time gentleman. He was somewhat effeminate in freshness of complexion and color perhaps, but his figure was robust and of good muscular development. He was simply elegant, and certainly one of the handsomest men the Army ever produced. Tensions in the Southwest following Texas' annexation led the United States military to begin to concentrate their forces closer to the Mexican border. Hooker and part of the 1st Artillery were stationed in Pensacola, Florida, and it was there that he got the first word about the battles of Resaca de la Palma and Palo Alto. Conflict made advancement, so Hooker was excited to get into the fight. By July, Hooker was placed on the staff of General Percifer F. Smith as brigade commissary. Quickly, Hooker was transferred to the politically appointed General Thomas Lyon Hamer as his chief of staff. Since Hamer had basically no military experience, Hooker would help him in his military role. Hooker and Hamer joined Zachary Taylor's army as it invaded Mexico and attacked the town of Monterey. In the battle, Hooker placed Hamer's brigade for battle and sent them into the fight, conducting himself bravely, even though the brigade was pushed back. Taylor observed much of Hooker's actions and mentioned Hooker in his official report, as did Hamer, who wrote, "I am under a particular obligation to the Chief of my staff, Lieutenant J. Hooker. By his soldierly conduct and fine military acquirements, he has been invaluable to me through the whole campaign, and his coolness and self-possession in battle set an example to both officers and men that exerted a most happy influence." Taylor sent part of his force to Saltillo, but Hamer's brigade remained at Monterey. For his actions at Monterey, Hooker was commissioned a brevet captain, but tragedy struck the brigade in December. Hamer passed away from dysentery, leaving Hooker without a position. By the next month, Hooker was transferred to the staff of Major General William Orlando Butler, another political appointee, but one with military experience, having been a captain in Andrew Jackson's army during the War of 1812. Hooker would be his aide-de-camp. However, it would be very uneventful, as most troops were being drawn off of Taylor's army and others to create another army under Winfield Scott to invade Mexico via Veracruz and attack the Mexican capital. Hooker was eager to make it to that campaign as it moved toward Mexico City. By April, he got his chance. He was transferred to be on the staff of Brigadier General George Cadwalader, as suggested by one of Hooker's biographers, to compensate for his superior's lack of military experience. Hooker landed at Veracruz in June and headed west to join Scott's army with Cadwalader and 1,000 troops. Along with the troops came a wagon train with several $100,000 worth of specie. On June 11th, the wagon train was stopped and attacked by Mexican irregulars. The Mexicans occupied a fort, which Hooker and the infantry attacked and drove the enemy away from the position, saving the money and securing the bridge at that location. For his actions, he received a brevet promotion to major. By July 8th, Hooker and Cadwalader caught up to Scott's army at Puebla. There, Hooker again was transferred to another command, to Division Commander Gideon Pillow's staff, officially as his Assistant Adjutant General, but in actuality he was Pillow's Chief of Staff. Pillow had been a successful Tennessee lawyer and was the former law partner of President James K. Polk. When the war broke out, he was appointed a brigadier general and was now a major general in charge of a division of troops. Again, Hooker would guide the military inexperienced Pillow through the upcoming campaign. Pillow understood Hooker's role too. He told Hooker, "When you see occasion for issuing an order, give it without reference to me. You understand these matters." As the United States Army pressed onward toward Mexico City, the National Road was their most direct route to the capital, but it was heavily fortified. A member of Scott's staff, Robert E. Lee, found a way around the fortified locations, and Pillow's division, along with another division, were to make the road. When it was discovered that around 6,000 Mexican troops were in front of them, Hooker was sent back to Scott to find out what to do. Scott commented that he wanted Pillow to build a road, not attack. By the time Hooker made it back to Pillow, his commander had already started the Battle of Contreras. During the fight, Hooker and Pillow went to Scott's headquarters, then got lost in the lava beds on their way back to the division. The next morning, Hooker's horse had strayed away, so Pillow returned to the division alone. In the Battle of Churubusco, Hooker was tasked with placing troops for an assault. Placing the men behind a church, he set off on foot to deliver a message from Pillow to one of the brigade commanders. While running across a field, he was attacked by a bull. Hooker drew his saber and began an impromptu bullfight. The animal was getting the better of Hooker, who was calling out for help. An infantryman close by shot the bull, saving Hooker from being maimed. When the Mexican troops surrendered during the battle, Hooker accepted their white flag. At the Battle of Chapultepec, Hooker again helped place troops, but the Voltigueras were pinned down without scaling ladders to allow them to advance. Hooker rushed back to hurry on the ladders, and then asked Pillow, who had been wounded in the foot, if he could maneuver a regiment to the left and hopefully outflank the Mexicans. Pillow gave him permission, but Hooker found the ground too steep. Nevertheless, Hooker returned to the thick of the fight just in time to see the Americans charge over the barricades and capture Chapultepec. For his actions during this battle, he got his third brevet promotion to lieutenant colonel. While in occupied Mexico City, Hooker enjoyed himself. The young ladies of the capital were very flirtatious with him, calling him El Capitan Hermoso. He, along with other officers, to keep alive their traditions from the war, formed the Aztec Club in October 1847. He and others spent time revisiting battlefields and studying tactics. When it was discovered that both Pillow and General William Worth were sending private letters to newspapers criticizing Winfield Scott and his actions during the campaign, Scott confronted them. When he did, he received defiance and insubordination. He had both men arrested. The president didn't like Scott and removed him, and then released Pillow and Worth. A court of inquiry was called to investigate the situation. Hooker testified for General Pillow. Although it wasn't critical of Scott, he was simply substantiating Pillow's actions during the campaign. Scott grew angry with Hooker. After the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, American forces were sent back to the United States, and Hooker was assigned to the 6th Military District as Adjutant General. That district encompassed Iowa, Illinois, and parts of Wisconsin and Missouri. Hooker's ambition wouldn't allow him to stay in the docile region long. He wanted to go to the newly acquired West Coast, and in November 1848 he got his wish, becoming the Adjutant General of the Pacific Division. Hooker traveled through the Isthmus of Panama and boarded the Pacific Mail Steamship Company's vessel called California on its first voyage, becoming the first American steam-driven boat to reach California. He landed in San Diego and was immediately detached for duty to mark the boundary between California and Mexico. That job took 4 months, and he was off to Sonoma, headquarters of the Pacific Division. He shared a house with General Percifer F. Smith, Major Philip Kearny, and Captain George Stoneman. When Hooker arrived, it relieved Lieutenant William T. Sherman of his duties as Adjutant General. Hooker and the General Staff toured the new division, including the gold mines that were bringing gold seekers and those looking to profit from the gold seekers into the area. After the excitement of seeing new land, monotony set in Sonoma, where paperwork filled Hooker's daily routine. It didn't help that his pay was stagnant, and regular day laborers all around him could make more in a couple of days than he did in a month. He apparently gave up drinking when leaving West Point, but by the time he made it to California, he was back in the habit and regularly visited the Blue Wing Tavern, where gambling, drinking, and other sordid activities took place. He requested a 2-year leave of absence, and it was granted on November 24, 1851. He hoped to profit from owning a ranch and purchased 550 acres of land at Agua Caliente, northwest of Sonoma. There he tried to grow grapes, but the wine was unpalatable, and his attempt to grow potatoes yielded inferior specimens to the ones grown near the coast. He ended up using the forest on his land as timber, hiring men to cut the timber so he could visit the Blue Wing Tavern and hunt in the woods north of his property. On one hunt, Hooker encountered a bear. He leveled his rifle at the animal and aimed, and pulled the trigger, but the weapon didn't go off. The bear charged, and Hooker and the bear tussled until they fell into a canyon, with Hooker falling into the limbs of a redwood tree. A search party found the badly mauled Hooker in that tree and extricated him. In 1853, Hooker lost horribly in a game of cards at the home of a prominent California resident, to the tune of nearly $500. Hooker signed a note saying that he would pay a Mr. Neville that amount at his earliest convenience. Mr. Neville signed the note over to another man, who demanded payment in full immediately, and harassed Hooker for the money. When Hooker was taken to court, Hooker explained to the judge that the note was a debt of honor, knowing that gambling debts were not collectible in court, and the case was dismissed. When his 2-year leave of absence ran out, Hooker resigned from the Army, feeling he could make a better life for himself on his ranch than in the Army. He also got a taste for politics. running for Sonoma County Road Overseer first, getting elected to that position, then running for the state assemblyman on the Democratic ticket. When he lost, he claimed that he had been robbed and that the other party imported voters to get his opponent elected. Finding farming too taxing and the life on the ranch too stressful, trying to get the property to yield, he sold his ranch and by 1857 got back into politics, helping his friend John B. Weller obtain the governorship of California. Probably as a result of his support, Hooker became the superintendent of military roads in Oregon. He was to build a road from Scottsburg, Oregon, to the California line. By winter 1858, it was completed and known for a time as the Hooker Road. By 1859, he was back in California and became a colonel in the state militia, but his dealings were in Oregon. Oregon politics was heated in the late 1850s. The party was splitting over the James Buchanan administration and the nomination of Stephen Douglas of Illinois as the Democratic presidential candidate. Hooker, because Buchanan had the support of the pro-slavery wing of the Democratic Party, supported Douglas. He wrote, "The administration and the 1,001 aspirants for the nomination are moving heaven and earth to defeat Douglas. If they should succeed, they defeat the ablest man in the party, and what is more, they defeat themselves. The Republicans know it, and they have joined in the hue and cry against Douglas. Whether he sinks or swims, his bitterest enemies must admit that he is of the stuff of which heroes are made. The office he is seeking can add no luster to his fame." In the election of 1860, Hooker voted for Douglas, but Abraham Lincoln won the election, sending the South into the throes of secession. As the Deep South began leaving the Union, Hooker took advantage of his military experience and began forming up a volunteer regiment and drilling them, but he soon found out that California regiments wouldn't be going east for the emerging war. Hooker was downcast. He offered his services to the commander of the United States Army, Winfield Scott, but had heard nothing. Plus, he had no money to go to Washington to lobby for a position in the growing army. Hooker found himself at Chapman's, a place to find food, drink, and amusement. The owner of the joint, Billy Chapman, came to Hooker and asked, "What's the matter, Captain?" "I was wishing that I was in the East. I'm a West Pointer, as you know, a trained soldier. I could be of use in this struggle, but here I am tied down to a ranch in California, merely because I lack funds to clear off some little debts and pay my expenses to Washington." "How much would you need?" inquired Billy. Hooker told him $700 would be enough, and Billy went to his safe and returned with a roll of bills, saying, "Here's 1,000, Captain. Take it and go to the front. I wish I could go with you, but I am not quite willing to be a private, and they wouldn't give a commission to a faro dealer. The steamer sails day after tomorrow. I'll be at the wharf to see you off, and you needn't buy any liquor or cigars to keep you cheerful on your way. There will be a few necessaries of that sort in your stateroom." Hooker took the $1,000 and began settling his affairs. The state of California wanted to thank him for his efforts with the militia before he left the California coast by throwing him a dinner, but Hooker declined, having too much to do before he boarded the ship. He wrote a letter thanking them, though. In it he wrote, "I go, gentlemen, to tender my services to the federal government with a will and a purpose, to seek an opportunity to prove my faith in and devotion to the Union of all the states, and to find a place, however humble, among those who have taken up arms to defend it." Hooker set off for Washington on May 21st, 1861, aboard the steamer, the St. Louis. Joseph Hooker made it to Washington, D.C. without incident. He immediately went to his political friends and asked them to lobby for him a position in the Union Army. After a meeting with Senator Edward Baker, a longtime friend of Abraham Lincoln, the senator wrote this letter to President Lincoln: "Sir, Colonel Joseph Hooker has just arrived from the Pacific coast and will wait on you in person. He desires to draw his sword for the country. He is an educated soldier. The history of the Mexican War is filled with battles in which he bore distinguished and honorable part. No regular officer of his rank won more renown, and no man of any rank showed more gallantry. His testimonials are of the very highest order. I have known him well, and add mine. You cannot rely too much on his capacity as a soldier and his loyalty as a man." As Hooker remained in Washington, he began to recognize some of his old comrades now commanding large groups of men in the Union Army. Men like Ambrose Burnside and William T. Sherman, who had been subordinate to him in the old army, were now in command of brigades. When he arrived on the East Coast, Hooker lobbied for a command of a regiment, but with renewed confidence in his own ability, he began to seek out a higher command, thinking that if his old subordinates commanded brigades, he was at least entitled to that size of command. When his state of Massachusetts offered him a command of one of the regiments, he turned it down, hoping to get a larger command. Hooker followed the throng of people following the Union Army to watch the Battle of Bull Run take place. It can be assumed that he observed the Union defeat with a critical eye and returned to Washington, seeking out his old superior, George Cadwalader. He introduced Hooker to Abraham Lincoln, introducing him as Captain Hooker. Lincoln greeted him, then turned to speak to others. Hooker spoke up and said, "Mr. President, I was introduced to you as Captain Hooker. I am, or was, Lieutenant Colonel Hooker of the regular army. When this war broke out, I was at home in California and hastened to make a tender of my services to the government, but my relation to General Scott or some other impediment stands in the way, and I now see no chance of making my military knowledge and experience useful. I am about to return, but before going I was anxious to pay my respects to you, sir, and to express my wish for your personal welfare and for your success in putting down the rebellion. And while I'm about it, Mr. President, I want to say one more thing, and that is that I was at the Battle of Bull Run the other day, and it is neither vanity or boasting in me to declare that I am a sight better general than you, sir, had on that field." Lincoln grabbed Hooker by the hand and sat down with him. After talking, Lincoln rose, put his hand on Hooker's shoulder, and said, "Colonel, not Lieutenant Colonel Hooker, stay. I have use for you and a regiment for you to command." Lincoln commented later, "His eye was steady and clear, his manner not half so confident as his words, and altogether he had the air of a man of sense and intelligence, who thoroughly believed in himself and who would at least try to make his words good." On August 3rd, Hooker's nomination by Congress was confirmed. He was to be a brigadier general of volunteers. Although it was signed off on August 3rd, his rank was backdated to May 17, 1861, along with a host of other brigadier generals, which would bring about difficulties in the future. Hooker became the 32nd highest-ranking general in the Army by September. He took command of a brigade in the Army organized by George B. McClellan. The brigade was made up of the 1st and 11th Massachusetts, the 2nd New Hampshire, and the 28th Pennsylvania. Hooker established Camp Union to the northeast of the city to watch the approaches from Baltimore. In September, the 1st Michigan joined the brigade, and by October, Hooker was elevated to division command, commanding his brigade and another brigade under Daniel Sickles, as well as some cavalry and an artillery battery. Also in October, Hooker and his division would be sent on a mission, minus the 1st Michigan, which was removed from the division, to the lower Potomac River to guard against Confederate incursions. Rebels and Southern sympathizers from Maryland were attempting to smuggle supplies from Maryland into Virginia via ferries and boats across the river south of Washington, and Hooker was named to stop it. With around 10,000 men, he set up telegraphic communications with McClellan, built warehouses, and prepared defenses against a possible Confederate attack. Hooker was strict with the discipline of his division, making sure that they were properly drilled and the camps were kept clean. His division possessed a low rate of hospitalizations due to Hooker's cleanliness of camps. An aeronautics station was built where Hooker employed a balloon to observe the enemy's works. Although he was skeptical at first, he quickly saw the value after a thorough map was constructed of the Virginia side of the river. In November, the division grew by another brigade, one containing the 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th New Jersey Infantry Regiments. The men delayed setting up winter quarters because they heard rumors that they would be sent to Charleston, South Carolina, or further south, but the cold weather soon set in, and the men were forced to build huts to protect them. The Potomac River soon froze over, which prevented supplies from getting to the division. Hooker used the 3rd Indiana Cavalry to patrol the water's edge and sniff out boats carrying the mail between Baltimore and Richmond. Try as they might, Hooker never could put a permanent end to the mail getting through. The rebels found all kinds of ways to sneak down to the river and get across it. The Hoosiers even used small boats to further patrol the water's edge, getting the nickname from Hooker as the Horse Marines. Runaway slaves were a huge issue for Hooker. He was anti-slavery, but he wasn't an abolitionist. When his superior, McClellan, ordered officers to return runaway slaves to their owners, Hooker didn't follow that to the letter. he did give permission to slave owners to come into camp and search for their slaves. At the same time McClellan was urging officers to return slaves, Congress made it a penal offense for officers to surrender fugitive slaves. When the Joint Committee on the Conduct of the War looked into the matter, Hooker remarked, "What the hell do they expect an officer to do?" If Hooker disobeyed orders, he faced a court-martial. If he obeyed them, he faced retribution from Congress. It was a lose-lose. Again, Hooker was anti-slavery, and his permitting of slave owners into the camp wasn't completely supportive of the owners. When some men came into camp stating that their slaves were in the Massachusetts camp and demanded McClellan's orders to be followed, Hooker replied, "Yes, I have seen the order, and yonder is the Massachusetts camp, and if your slaves are there and choose to go with you, and the Massachusetts boys are content, I have no objections. But if they refuse, and a row occurs over there, I fear you will get into the guardhouse, the same as any other marauders." The slave owners asked, "But General Hooker, are you not going to apprehend our slaves for us?" Hooker replied, "Why, bless my soul, no. I am a Brigadier General, United States Volunteers, and no slave catcher. I was born and bred in New England." All wasn't pleasant in the division, especially at the brigade level of command. When Hooker was raised to division command, that left his spot vacant in the brigade. The successor thought too highly of himself and butted heads with Hooker on multiple occasions. His other brigade commander, Daniel Sickles, couldn't get his brigadier general status confirmed by Congress because he was a Democrat and the Republican Party didn't want him to have such a position. The 3rd Brigade also lacked a brigadier general. Colonel Samuel H. Starr of the 5th New Jersey commanded the brigade while the division was in Maryland. By the latter part of January 1862, Hooker's repeated urging at launching an attack on the Confederate battery emplacements on the Virginia side of the river got approved. Lincoln made February 22nd the day for a general advance by all Union armies. McClellan had been planning an advance, but this urging by Lincoln confounded his own plan. Nevertheless, he approved of Hooker making the attack. When the day for the assault across the river came, a multitude of problems began to arise. By February 15th, the planned day of attack, the necessary boats hadn't arrived. McClellan offered him an ironclad steamer and an additional 10,000 to 15,000 more men. By February 27th, Hooker received a wire from McClellan stating to make no further advancements. McClellan's chief of engineers told the commanding general that it would take 3 divisions of infantry and that McClellan himself should lead the group. He also made the comment that the landing point was too hazardous. The attack was called off, and Hooker's dreams of making an impactful attack in the war dematerialized. In early March, the Confederates evacuated their position in a chorus of explosions and black smoke. They destroyed all that couldn't be brought with them. Some of Hooker's men moved across the river and raised their colors over the abandoned rebel works. Soon the Army of the Potomac would be divided into 4 corps. Hooker's division was put in the 3rd Corps under Samuel Heintzelman. McClellan received approval of his plan to land on the peninsula in Virginia formed by the York and James Rivers and proceed to Richmond. It took nearly a month for every soldier to be transported to the peninsula, and Hooker's division was one of the last scheduled units to make the journey. On the peninsula, the 3rd Corps and Hooker were on the extreme right of the Union line near Yorktown. McClellan ordered trenches and fortifications built, and Hooker's men began the grueling work in the wet weather. It became such hard work that the Army issued extra whiskey rations to those doing the work. Unfortunately for them, the officers, through whom the rations passed through, filled their own canteens with whiskey and diluted what was left with water so that the men got their correct ration. The privates quickly found out what had happened, and one private from New Hampshire approached Hooker with a dipper of liquor. He asked Hooker to take a swig of the whiskey, and when he did, Hooker spit it out and threw the dipper into the brush. Cursing those who ruined his troops' rations, Hooker made sure the spirits went directly through his headquarters so he could supervise the rations to the privates. McClellan's siege at Yorktown resulted in giving the Confederacy about a month to concentrate forces against him. When the Confederates began to withdraw up the peninsula toward Richmond, the Union Army gave chase, and Hooker was among some of the commanders in front. Hooker chased the rebels all the way to a fortification called Fort Magruder. Since Hooker was out front and away from many of his superiors, he saw this as his opportunity to utilize his aggressive style and not be held back by timid superiors. He began to form his division for an attack on the fort, but before he could launch an attack, the Confederates sallied forth and made their own assault. The battle began to rage, and Hooker's men were holding on, but it was a desperate struggle, as it seemed the Confederates kept renewing their attacks with new troops. Hooker, as would become accustomed, sat on his horse next to his men, instilling confidence in them and boosting morale. At one point his horse was hit by a bullet. Hooker dismounted, examined the wound, then remounted. When one of his batteries approached the battle, Hooker asked where it was going. To the front, came the reply. Hooker exclaimed, "My God, there is no front. Can you go into battery here?" When the cannons with double canister went off, Hooker's horse reared and fell back on him. Uninjured, Hooker remounted and continued to try and stabilize his line. His men began to run out of ammunition and were beginning to withdraw. Hooker helped organize a steady withdrawal with the help of his artillery and kept the Confederates at bay. Philip Kearny, recently given command of the 3rd Division of the 3rd Corps, brought his men up and was told to take orders from Hooker. After putting one brigade into the fight, Kearny and Hooker came together, and Kearny said, "I think I rank you." Hooker replied, "Certainly, General, you do." The battle came to an end, and Hooker took his men behind the lines and had them build fires to warm themselves. In the reports filed by McClellan about the battle, he left out Hooker and Kearny's attacks and focused mainly on the battle in Winfield Scott Hancock's front. After seeing the reports, Hooker looked at Lieutenant Colonel Mott of the 5th New Jersey and said, "Mott, it seems to me you and I and your Jersey Blues and the Excelsior Brigade were not at Williamsburg at all. Hancock did the business." About the same time, Hooker wrote a letter to his friend, Senator James Nesmith, about McClellan. He is not only not a soldier, but he does not know what soldiership is. He is no more of a man than McDowell. Later he wrote, "McClellan is an infant among soldiers. Form no opinion of what you read in the newspapers. They and the wires are under McClellan's control, hence the flattery, etc. The blazoning about the bayonet charge of Hancock is all stuff." For his part in the Battle of Williamsburg, Hooker got his nickname, but not in the traditional way. A typesetter for a New York newspaper put together a column for the paper and entitled it, "Fighting Joe Hooker." From then on, he retained the name Fightin' Joe Hooker. However, there is some controversy as to how the nickname came about. One of his biographers explained, "This account of the derivation of his nickname has been the accepted story, and it is supported by a wealth of detail concerning the incident, but it is still not altogether satisfactory. The typesetter involved purportedly worked for the New York Courier and Enquirer, but by 1862, this paper had been swallowed up by the New York World. The sobriquet does not appear in any issue of the World immediately after the Battle of Williamsburg or any other battle on the peninsula. Fightin' Joe does not appear in common usage for 4 months after Williamsburg. A reasonable conclusion is that in some spontaneous manner it was applied to Hooker after Williamsburg, and was revived popularly as his aggressive leadership guided his command into one desperate fight after another. Hooker reached out to the press writing, "Don't call me Fightin' Joe, for that name has done and is doing me incalculable injury. It makes a portion of the public think that I am a hot-headed, furious young fellow, accustomed to making furious and needless dashes at the enemy." Nevertheless, the name stuck. Once Hooker's division recovered and the Army of the Potomac began their push westward toward the capital at Richmond, Hooker and his men followed, taking up a position on the Union left, south of the Chickahominy River. As it stood, 2/5 of the Union Army were south of the river, with the rest north of it, presenting a precarious situation if one was attacked. Hooker was stationed at Poplar Hill. When the Confederate Army under Joseph E. Johnston took advantage of the separation of McClellan's force, it resulted in the Battle of Seven Pines or Fair Oaks. Rebel mismanagement resulted in the attacks falling apart, and Union reinforcements halted the attacks further. On the morning of June 2nd, Hooker led part of his division toward a counterattack, which held the rebels in check. During the battle, one good story of Hooker's personality came out. When 2 New Jersey regiments came to a swamp in their advance, Hooker was in the lead. A soldier told him that no one could get through the swamp. Hooker, in dashing fashion, replied, "Get out of the way. I have 2 regiments here that can go anywhere." In late June, Hooker and another division of Heintzelman's corps was to advance their pickets and then their battle lines. When given the command to move, the division moved out, Hooker keeping an eye on his line. They battled and pushed back rebel defenders, and the day seemed to be going well. Then a telegram came from McClellan ordering the commanders to pull their men back to their starting position. Both Heintzelman and Hooker were astonished at the order. The advance was going so well, but if they stopped, they would lose all their momentum. Puzzled, but following orders, they halted. When McClellan arrived on the field and was told of the success, he ordered them to continue, but it didn't meet the previous success. The Battle of Oak Grove ended, with not much in the way of change in the battle lines. The day after the Battle of Oak Grove, the Battle of Mechanicsville opened. Miscommunication and mismanagement on the Confederacy's part led to the Union inflicting heavy casualties on the rebels. McClellan sent a telegram to Hooker on the left of the line telling the division commander to tell his men, "Porter's whipped 'em on the right." When Fitzjohn Porter and his corps retreated so soon after the battle, the men of Hooker's division began to welcome any good news with, "Porter's whipped 'em on the right." The 7 days battle bluffed McClellan into pulling back down the peninsula. When Hooker and his fellow division commander Kearny got the message, they fumed and went to see McClellan. One of Hooker's biographers described the meeting. In haste, they rode over to McClellan's headquarters, where Kearny insisted on being permitted to march into Richmond and at least rescue the 14,000 prisoners there, returning if he could not hold on. Hooker, who was Kearny's junior in rashness as well as rank, agreed that this could be done, but suggested that another division should go along as support. Heintzelman also lent his voice to the proposal, but McClellan coldly refused. Kearny then gave the commanding general as thorough a verbal beating as was possible, short of inciting a court-martial. As the army pulled back, Hooker helped guard the rear. At the Battle of Glendale, or Fraser's Farm, he wasn't directly engaged, but did send a brigade of men to help push back a Confederate breakthrough. Even though it wasn't his most impressive feat of the war, it got him some of the most attention he had received from the commanding general. The army continued to pull back and form at a place called Malvern Hill. Most of the fighting took place on the left of the Union line, away from Hooker, but he did send Daniel Sickles' brigade to throw back a Confederate attack on the Union left flank. Other than that, the division did very little fighting. However, a newspaper correspondent stuck with Hooker's division, and needing a good story, wrote a fabricated piece for his paper stating that the fate of the Army of the Potomac depended on Hooker and his division. This further boosted Hooker in the minds of the Northern public, who read the story and knew no difference. The Army of the Potomac continued their withdrawal down the peninsula, and during this time McClellan informed Hooker that he was being looked at considerably for the command of a corps. Hooker's ambition soared, and he began to write somewhat favorably of McClellan during this time. Hooker wrote to a friend in the Senate that, if these officers are still to be imposed upon McClellan, God help him in this army. I will sooner dig potatoes or cut down trees than belong to any army in which all these officers exercise commands. If I cannot be placed upon the same footing of other officers of the army, the sooner I quit it, the better. I will not fight their battles for them with the doors to promotion closed on me. In late July, promotion came for both Hooker and his friend Kearny, raising them to the rank of Major General of Volunteers. Hooker celebrated, and the chief commissary for the division placed 200 candles in the branches of the trees surrounding headquarters. The sight was said to be surpassingly beautiful. In early August, McClellan ordered Hooker's division and John Sedgwick's division to push west and capture Malvern Hill. Hooker did so, and it caused the new commander of the Confederate Army, Robert E. Lee, to dispatch troops to deal with Hooker, but Hooker got an order to withdraw before a major battle at Malvern Hill could happen for a second time. Lincoln and the Secretary of War felt that the Peninsula Campaign had been a failure and ordered McClellan to move his men off the peninsula and transport them to Aquia Creek, where they would be added to the growing Army of Virginia under General John Pope, fresh from his campaigns in the Western Theater. On August 21st, Hooker and his division departed the peninsula on their way to Northern Virginia. Hooker left the area having gained high honors for his actions and gained the confidence of his men. One member of the division wrote, "Hooker was always present on the field, alert and vigilant, conspicuously mounted on a white horse, with flashing eyes, florid face, and high shirt collar, that soon wilted down when we got engaged, but as cool and collected under fire as if directing a parade or a picnic. He always seemed to know exactly what to do and when to do it." Hooker and his division traveled from the peninsula to Aquia Creek, a landing location for many of the troops coming from George McClellan's army on their way to John Pope's Army of Virginia. However, the troops wouldn't disembark there. They went on to Alexandria, disembarked, and went by rail to Manassas Junction, barely missing Confederate General Stonewall Jackson as he captured the railway in the rear of the Union Army. When Pope discovered that Jackson was behind him, he dispatched some troops to deal with him. Those troops would be Joseph Hooker's division. The Confederates that Hooker discovered around Bristow Station were simply attempting to delay Hooker while they destroyed track and captured supplies, but Hooker was able to land a few blows against the withdrawing Confederates. The rebels withdrew to the Old Manassas battlefield, and Hooker bivouacked at Blackburn's Ford. Jackson took refuge behind and in an unfinished railroad cut. One of Hooker's brigades was detached from the division and fought with Franz Sigel's troops for a time during this second Battle of Manassas. Hooker launched attacks against Jackson's fortified position as ordered by his superiors, and although some of his men found success, the attacks, as Hooker explained, produced senseless bloodletting to gain no military advantage. One of Hooker's biographers explained Hooker's frustration with the battle. The day's action had been unsatisfactory for Hooker. His division had been split and sent in by brigades, some not even under his direction. They had suffered heavily and nothing been gained. Only Grover's charge was as distinguished a performance as the Hooker division could have been expected to give. When Confederate General James Longstreet arrived with the other half of the Confederate Army, he delivered a massive attack against Pope's forces, sending the Union troops retreating over the Virginia landscape. After getting his division on their way to safety, Hooker continued to help other units get out of harm's way, riding back and forth, organizing the disorganized, and making sure as many men got on the road following the rest of the shattered army. At Centerville, Virginia, Hooker and his division rested, but Hooker personally was ordered to come to Pope's headquarters. Pope wanted him to take his division and move north to stop a possible rebel threat. Hooker informed Pope that his men were exhausted and too bloodied to fight so soon. They had lost roughly a third of their fighting force. So Pope dispatched Hooker alone, telling him to take command of any troops he found along the way and block the Confederates from cutting the Union Army off from Washington. In a downpour on September 1, 1862, the Battle of Chantilly broke out, with much of the fighting happening to the left of Hooker's line. Although the Union soldiers blunted the Confederate advance, it came at a terrible price. Philip Kearny, Hooker's friend, was killed in the engagement. When the body came back into the Union lines, under a flag of truce, Hooker commanded the troops it passed through. The sight of the body greatly affected Hooker. The day before Kearny died, Kearny wrote a letter discussing the Second Battle of Bull Run. In it, he wrote, "The army ran like sheep, all but General Hooker." The Army of Virginia streamed back to Washington, D.C. following the defeat. Abraham Lincoln now had a decision to make. Who could take command of the Union Army in the East? In a meeting with his cabinet, the president and the other officials labored over who to name as the head of the army. Pope had failed. McClellan was slow and worked against the administration, and Irvin McDowell had lost his first battle, the first major battle of the war, the first Battle of Bull Run. One of Hooker's biographers described the scene. Lincoln asked Secretary of the Navy Gideon Welles whom he would suggest to take command of the Army of the Potomac. Without much consideration, Welles named Hooker. Nodding approvingly, Lincoln responded, "I think as much as you or any other man of Hooker, but I fear he gets excited." Postmaster General Blair, who was present, then put in a damper, saying, "He is too great a friend of John Barleycorn." Welles replied, "If his habits are bad, if he ever permits himself to get intoxicated, he ought not to be trusted with such a command." Lincoln ultimately chose McClellan to lead the army. He hadn't been removed as the commander of the Army of the Potomac. The troops had just been taken away from him and given to Pope. McClellan was in command of the forces guarding the capital, but now the troops that made up the Army of Virginia were in the capital. McClellan now took command of the Army of the Potomac with the addition of the corps from the Army of Virginia. A reorganization of the army took place as some generals left the army. Hooker received his long-awaited appointment as a corps commander, taking command of the 3rd Corps of the Army of Virginia, which had originally been the 1st Corps of the Army of the Potomac, before it was detached. As Hooker moved his new corps into Maryland, chasing after Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia, his corps was renamed the 1st Corps, reverting back to its original designation. Both the 1st Corps under Hooker and the 9th Corps under Jesse Reno were under the command of Ambrose Burnside as they headed into the Maryland countryside. The close proximity of the Confederate Army to Pennsylvania scared that state's governor, and he called on the president to send him 80,000 troops. He didn't, but he would send him a general, a Pennsylvanian, to organize the state's forces. John Reynolds was named as that general, but he commanded a division in Hooker's corps, one of the better commanders under Hooker. Hooker wrote a letter to McClellan to fight back against sending Reynolds away. I request that the Major General commanding will not heed this order. A scared governor ought not to be permitted to destroy the usefulness of an entire division of the army on the eve of important operations. General Reynolds commands a division of Pennsylvania troops of not the best character, is well known to them, and I have no officer to fill his place. It is satisfactory to my mind that the rebels have no more intention of going to Harrisburg than they have of going to heaven. It is only in the United States that atrocities like this are entertained. Reynolds was sent to Pennsylvania despite Hooker's misgivings, and a brigade commander named George Gordon Meade took command of the division. Meade, hearing the protest, felt his own character was sullied by Hooker's strong will to keep Reynolds in command of the division. Nevertheless, Hooker and the First Corps proceeded west, towards South Mountain, where Confederate General James Longstreet's wing of the Confederate Army guarded the mountain passes there. Hooker was ordered to take Turner's Gap in South Mountain and dispatched his troops accordingly, with Meade performing great service that got Hooker's attention, enough to give the division commander praise from Hooker. As the fighting intensified, McClellan came up to Hooker and asked who was fighting on the National Road. Hooker replied that it was John Gibbon's brigade of Western men. McClellan exclaimed, "They must be made of iron," and Hooker replied, "By the eternal, they are iron. If you had seen them at Bull Run, as I did, you would know them to be iron." This exchange between McClellan and Hooker gave the brigade its immortalized name of the Iron Brigade. Sunset essentially brought an end to the battle, and the next day Hooker's corps pushed through South Mountain. The Army of the Potomac found the Army of Northern Virginia outside the little town of Sharpsburg, Maryland. On September 17th, Hooker's corps moved forward to attack the left flank of the rebel army. Hooker rode close to the action. A newspaper correspondent wrote, "Hooker's eyes gleamed with the fierce joy of battle, and he disposed his forces with wonderful rapidity. Shot and shell fell about Hooker and his staff, covering them with dirt and making horses almost unmanageable." Hooker exposed himself to danger that morning, getting his horse wounded in the process. When Hooker saw a wavering regiment, he sent orders by way of a newspaper correspondent named George Smalley to its colonel. The colonel balked at the thought of getting an order from anyone other than a staff member. Smalley said he would report his insubordination to Hooker. The colonel allegedly said, "Oh, for God's sake, don't do that. I had rather face the rebels than Hooker." At one point, Hooker rode to the very front, a dangerous place for a corps commander to be. Seeing the danger, he dismounted to get away from the enemy bullets while he analyzed the situation, then remounted. Soon Hooker swayed in the saddle and was helped down when he was a safe distance away from the fighting. A surgeon looked him over and found that a bullet had went through his foot, but he couldn't tell if any bones were broken. The general was put on a stretcher and taken away. His last order on the field was, "There is a regiment to the right. Order it forward. Crawford and Gordon are coming up. Tell them to carry the woods and hold them, and it is our fight." The pain was incredible, and Hooker passed out at least once. He attempted to relay information to General Edwin Sumner about the situation to his front, but was too weak. Hooker was taken to the Pry Mansion, the headquarters of McClellan. That afternoon he was transported to Centerville, Maryland, where he wrote a letter to his brother-in-law. "A great battle has been fought, and we are victorious. I had the honor to open it yesterday afternoon, and it continued till 10 o'clock this morning, when I was wounded and compelled to quit the field. The battle was fought with great violence on both sides. The carnage has been awful. I only regret that I was not permitted to take part in the operations until they were concluded, for I had counted on either capturing their army or driving them into the Potomac. My wound has been painful, but it is not one that will be likely to lay me up. I was shot through the foot." This letter found its way into the newspapers a few days after the battle, and many began to take this account as completely true, that had Hooker not been wounded, the Union would have crushed Lee's army and driven it into the Potomac River. All this added to the growing support by the public and politicians of Hooker's ability and his reputation. For his efforts, his friends in California raised $5,000 to make him a sword, but before it could be presented to Hooker, it was discovered that a general couldn't accept a gift of that value from a group of individuals. So it was put on display in Sacramento until the state legislature could pass a resolution to purchase it and present it to Hooker. Some Californians bought him a huge white thoroughbred stallion to be presented to the general. Hooker convalesced in a room in the Washington Insane Asylum where he received guests, one of them a cabinet member. The Secretary of the Treasury, Salmon P. Chase, arrived on September 23rd with his daughter Kate. They presented the general with a fruit basket, and Chase and Hooker discussed the status of the Army. Lincoln would later say of Chase that his head was full of presidential maggots, meaning he wanted to be president, and Chase felt that getting close to the general he felt would win the war would allow him to rise up politically. Chase returned to Hooker's room on multiple occasions, further hedging his bet on Hooker being the standout general of the war and hoping to get on his good side in the event Chase ran for president. As Hooker recovered, he began to take trips around the city to see various officials, including Secretary Chase and Secretary of War Edwin Stanton. However, the most dangerous visit was to Senator McDougal of California. At the senator's room at the Willard Hotel, an inventor was demonstrating a weapon for Hooker and the senator when it accidentally went off, firing a bullet between the general and the senator. According to a newspaper, the three men continued to talk as if nothing had happened. All of Hooker's politicking didn't result in him being named the commander of the Army of the Potomac when McClellan was finally removed from command. Ambrose Burnside now commanded the army. He was hesitant to take command, but allegedly took it to keep someone like Hooker from leading the army. Hooker rejoined the army on November 11th, being informed that he would now command the 5th Corps, but that would be short-lived. Burnside reorganized the 6 corps into 3 grand divisions, with Hooker commanding the Center Grand Division, encompassing the 3rd and 5th Corps. Despite him now commanding 40,000 men, this did not deter him from criticizing his superiors, Burnside, McClellan, or John Pope. He wrote a letter criticizing all of them to Secretary of War Edwin Stanton. Burnside called his Grand Division commanders together, Hooker, Edwin Sumner, and William B. Franklin. Burnside suggested crossing a few miles downriver from Fredericksburg, but Sumner and Franklin weren't enthused about that idea, but they said they would follow Burnside's orders. Hooker suggested to cross the Rappahannock River about 12 miles upriver from Fredericksburg. Ultimately, Burnside decided to cross at Fredericksburg in the face of the enemy. Franklin's Grand Division would be on the left, Sumner's on the right, and Hooker's would follow Sumner. On the morning of December 13th, with much of the Union Army across the Rappahannock River, ready to attack Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia on Marye's Heights and Prospect Hill, Hooker, Sumner, and Burnside watched from the Lacey House. Hooker was already mad by this point because 2 divisions, his own old division and Kearny's old division, 2 of the best, were detached and given to Franklin. Hooker was ordered to take the rest of his command across the river, which was basically now just the 5th Corps, now commanded by Daniel Butterfield. Butterfield and himself were greeted by generals from Sumner's failed attacks against Marye's Heights. They told Hooker not to order his men in. Hooker went personally to Burnside and asked for a discontinuation of the attacks, but the orders were unchanged. To add to Hooker's anger, another division was taken from his command and sent elsewhere, meaning as Grand Division commander, he only commanded 2 divisions instead of 2 whole corps. One of those divisions, under Andrew Humphreys, made a forlorn attack against Marye's Heights and was dismantled. When the last division under Hooker was ordered in, he stopped it, saying later, "Finding that I had lost as many men as my orders required me to lose, I suspended the attack." At the conclusion of the Battle of Fredericksburg, Hooker commanded the troops who occupied the town, and a few days later, when Burnside ordered all the troops back across the Rappahannock River, Hooker supervised the movement of those soldiers. Also following the battle, Hooker testified for the first time before the Committee on the Conduct of the War, criticizing 2 men primarily, Burnside and Franklin. He believed Franklin had not done all he could do to win the battle. In January, Burnside attempted another offensive, a march, to get around Lee's left flank by crossing the Rappahannock upriver from Fredericksburg. The march devolved into a quagmire as soldiers, animals, wagons, and artillery struggled to move through the deep Virginia mud. This incident further convinced Hooker of Burnside's inability to lead the Army of the Potomac. Burnside couldn't stand the backbiting happening in the Army, and wrote his General Order No. 8, which said in part, "General Joseph Hooker, having been guilty of unjust and unnecessary criticisms of the actions of his superior officers and of the authorities, and having by the general tone of his conversation endeavored to create distrust in the minds of officers who have associated with him, and having by omissions and otherwise made reports and statements which were calculated to create incorrect impressions, and for habitually speaking in disparaging terms of other officers, is hereby dismissed from the service of the United States as a man unfit to hold an important commission during a crisis like the present. Not only did he propose to remove Hooker from command, but he wanted to remove others, including William F. Smith and William B. Franklin, for similar reasons. All those Burnside listed had gone behind the general's back to criticize him to the President and other politicians. Burnside's staff asked him to not issue it until he had shown it to the President. Burnside agreed and took it to the President, along with a letter of resignation. Lincoln would need to accept one or the other. Lincoln said he wouldn't act on anything until he discussed it with his cabinet members. Lincoln would say to his advisers, "This is all true. Hooker does talk badly, but the trouble is he is stronger with the country today than any other man. Even if the country were told of Hooker's talk, they would not believe it." The discussion for the next commander of the army began between Lincoln and his cabinet. Burnside could not be kept on. The three highest ranking within the army was Hooker, Edwin Sumner, and William B. Franklin. Franklin was now seen as a contributing factor in the defeat at Fredericksburg, so he couldn't be chosen. Sumner was too old. That left Hooker out of the Grand Division commanders. However, three other men were thought of. William S. Rosecrans, the victor at the Battle of Stones River and the commander of the Army of the Cumberland, was talked about, but because he was a Westerner, they didn't want to put him in command of an Eastern-dominated army. George Gordon Meade, who had just been put in as commander of Hooker's 5th Corps, was a top contender for the position, and John F. Reynolds of the 1st Corps was also suggested, but Reynolds didn't want the position. That left Meade or Hooker. Lincoln chose Hooker. One newspaper declared when it heard the news of Hooker's appointment, "With Rosecrans in the West and Hooker in the East, there is not treason enough in the North, rebellion enough in the South, or imbecility or cross purposes sufficient in the cabinet to prevent the war for the Union from being brought to an early and satisfactory conclusion." Hooker got word of his appointment and issued his General Orders No. 1, which stated in part, "By direction of the President of the United States, the undersigned assumes command of the Army of the Potomac. Since the formation of this army, he has been identified with its history. He has shared with you its glories and reverses, with no other desire than that these relations might remain unchanged until its destiny should be accomplished. To secure these ends, your commander will require the cheerful and zealous cooperation of every officer and soldier in this army. In equipment, intelligence, and valor the enemy is our inferior. Let us never hesitate to give him battle wherever we can find him." Afterward, Hooker left for Washington to meet with Lincoln. After their meeting, Lincoln handed Hooker a letter building up the new commander, but also rebuking him for fostering ill will and backbiting within the army, especially against Burnside. Nevertheless, Hooker returned to the Army of the Potomac with a renewed vigor and a determination to lead it to glory on future battlefields. If you like what I do, please consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't done so already, join the Patreon page, and purchase something from one of my online stores. Every little bit helps. Thank you. Joseph Hooker left Washington, D.C. and President Abraham Lincoln and returned to the Army of the Potomac. His first order of business was to reorganize the Army. He deemed Ambrose Burnside's Grand Division concept too cumbersome and got rid of that designation, leaving 7 Corps with the 11th Corps being sent away. Arguably, his most important part of his reorganization was taking the sparsed-out cavalry, which was divided through the Army, and concentrated it into a single cavalry corps, like the Confederates had done. He also ordered its commander, George Stoneman, to regularly attack Confederate pickets to gain small victories to build up morale. Most historians believe this and other factors in 1863 led to the mounted arm of the Army of the Potomac to compete with and defeat the rebel counterpart. Desertions were up throughout the Army, and Hooker set about trying to curtail this massive amount of men leaving the ranks. It was estimated 200 men a day left the Army. To stop this, Abraham Lincoln issued an amnesty to all soldiers who returned to their units, and Hooker made Army life better for the soldiers, building new hospitals and renovating old ones, establishing brigade bakeries, and trying to get a variety of food issued to the men. Hooker said, "My men shall be fed before I am fed, and before any of my officers are fed." Going further, Hooker reorganized the leave system, giving men an opportunity to go home and making the punishment for unruliness the inability to get leave. In this way, he improved morale and order within the Army by using leave as an incentive. He promoted the writing of major engagements in which a regiment did service on the regimental flags. Hooker also developed the Corps badge, so his corps, division, and brigade commanders could take pride in their units, and so they could be more identifiable on the battlefield. Alcohol and women followed the Army constantly, which became a battle to combat. Not only women, but images of them in various lewd acts made their way through the camps. One man was horrified at the large number of obscene books and prints constantly passing down through the post office to the soldiers of the Army of the Potomac. Union soldier and historian Charles Francis Adams, Jr. wrote, "During the winter of 1862-63, when Hooker was in command, the headquarters of the Army of the Potomac was a place to which no self-respecting man liked to go, and no decent woman could go. It was a combination of barroom and brothel." The administration essentially gave up trying to curtail the women of ill repute in the camps, concluding that if the officers refused to cooperate with the order, there wasn't much to be done. Most information as to the enemy's whereabouts came from scouts, deserters, civilian informants, and cavalry expeditions. Hooker helped establish the Bureau of Military Information, led by Colonel George Sharp, to compile and examine this information, which led to a more coordinated effort and more accurate information. None of these reforms would have been possible without the help of Hooker's Chief of Staff, Daniel Butterfield. Some historians even go further and believe that Butterfield was the mastermind behind a lot of the reforms. Nevertheless, Hooker deserves great credit for holding the Army together and making it better. The Assistant Adjutant General of the Second Corps remarked, "The Army of the Potomac never spent 3 months to better advantage." In late February 1863, Confederate cavalry crossed the Rappahannock River to gain information on Hooker's army, its whereabouts, and if it was planning to move. The report came to Confederate Army Commander Robert E. Lee that Hooker appeared to be staying put during the winter and not evacuating. During that rebel expedition, Hooker dispatched his own cavalry after the enemy horsemen, but the Federal cavalry didn't catch the enemy. Hooker remarked to a cavalry officer, "I know the South and I know the North. In point of skill, of intelligence, and of pluck, the rebels will not compare with our men if they are equally well led. Our soldiers are a better quality of men. They are better fed, better clothed, better armed, and infinitely better mounted, for the rebels are fully half mounted on mules, and their animals get but 2 rations of forage per week, while ours get 7. Now, with such soldiers and such a cause as we have behind them, the best cause since the world began, we ought to be invincible, and by God, sir, we shall be. You have got to stop these disgraceful cavalry surprises. I'll have no more of them. I give you full power over your officers to arrest, cashier, shoot, whatever you will, only you must stop these surprises. And by God, sir, if you don't do it, I give you fair notice, I will relieve the whole of you and take command of the cavalry myself." In mid-April, Hooker outlined his plan but kept it secret, sending Butterfield to the President personally to tell him about the plan and ask him not to divulge it. Hooker intended to cross the Rappahannock River upstream from Fredericksburg and turn Robert E. Lee's left flank. Hooker even kept his corps commanders in the dark, too scared that the word may get out and Lee would counter his thrust to the west. Rains delayed Hooker's movement, and it finally got underway at 5:30 a.m. on April 27, 1863. While Hooker moved with the larger force to the fords of the Rappahannock, he left John Sedgwick in charge of troops around Fredericksburg and for him to make an attack there, hoping to trap Lee between the two Union forces. Hooker spoke boastfully of him bagging Lee's army and talked of victory, but as his army moved across the river, a different tone began to overtake Hooker. One of his biographers explains, "A letter from Butterfield to Sedgwick, written after Hooker had retired for the night, shows that Hooker was favorably considering the possibility of taking a strong position near Chancellorsville and waiting for Lee to attack him on his chosen ground. Sedgwick was cautioned not to upset the plan by allowing his demonstration to bring on a general engagement. This was the first note of weakness to creep into the forceful moves of the last 3 days. An offensive campaign was supposedly being waged, but the general was now thinking of maneuvering in such a manner as to permit him to fight a defensive battle, But what if Lee did not choose to fight on Hooker's chosen ground? Was he to be allowed to retreat to a defense of Richmond? Was it possible that Hooker had already forgotten that his real purpose was to destroy the enemy, not just maneuver Lee out of his defenses? When John Reynolds, commander of the 1st Corps, reported to Hooker that between 3,000 to 5,000 reinforcements from Richmond were headed to confront Sedgwick on the Federal left, Hooker saw his victory as magnified if the Confederate force was larger. Hooker dashed off General Order No. 47, stating, "It is with heartfelt satisfaction the Commanding General announces to the Army that the operations of the last 3 days have determined that our enemy must either ingloriously fly or come out from behind its defenses and give us battle on our own ground, where certain destruction awaits him." By the night of the 30th, Hooker's force was now in an area known as the Wilderness, a location that had been cut for the purpose of running an iron furnace, and the new growth brought with it a dense undergrowth and was difficult to see past a few yards. At the Chancellor House, a brick mansion, Hooker met with the cavalry commander Alfred Pleasanton. According to Pleasanton, he advised Hooker to move his army a few miles to the east, essentially out of the wilderness, to better terrain, but Hooker refused to move that night. The army commander got some sleep, confident about the coming days. A dense fog covered the army on May 1st, delaying any movement by the army had Hooker ordered such an advance. By 11 a.m., the corps commanders were ordered to push east through the wilderness, and Sedgwick was ordered to make a demonstration against the enemy to his front until further orders were given. It wasn't long before the Union columns began to march, and they began to run into stiff Confederate resistance. When Hooker got the news, he was in a state of hesitation. The immense responsibility of every decision from this point on was weighing heavily upon him. In the past, when he had been in command of a division or corps, there had always been someone else to make the chief decisions, and someone for him to criticize later. Now it was all Hooker. The self-confidence fostered since boyhood was ebbing fast. Perhaps he had missed the stimulant, which he had resolved to deny himself. Fightin' Joe had gained his reputation as a stand-up fighter, but he had hoped to prove by his direction of the army that this was not his only military accomplishment. Upon hearing the news, Hooker ordered his advanced units to retreat, leading one historian to write, "When he called in his advance, the battle became Lee's, not his. He was still commander of the Army of the Potomac, but Lee was commander of the field of battle." Hooker paced on the front porch of the Chancellor House and remarked to Corps Commander Darius Couch, "It is all right, Couch. I have got Lee just where I want him. He must fight me on my own ground." On the morning of May 2nd, Hooker rode around his lines to examine his defenses and was content at letting Lee attack him or attack if the opportunity may arise. During the day, Hooker got reports that Confederates were moving toward Culpeper, and it was suspected that all of Lee's army was in retreat. But even if Hooker believed this, he didn't mount a pursuit. Daniel Sickles and his 3rd Corps advanced and attacked a column of Confederates and took some prisoners. That evening, Hooker was on the porch of the Chancellor House listening to the artillery fire on the left of his line when one of his staff members looked down the plank road through his field glasses and yelled, "My God, here they come!" The troops Hooker saw and reported to him as Lee's army in retreat had been Stonewall Jackson's corps moving around to the Union right flank and had struck Olive Otis Howard's 11th Corps. Hooker quickly mounted his horse with his staff and hurried down the road, passing frantic pack animals, camp followers, and scared soldiers from the 11th Corps. Hooker knew he needed fresh troops and thought of the 1st Corps. He had ordered them from Fredericksburg that morning, and they should be close at hand. Coincidentally, the leader of the 1st Corps, John Reynolds, rode up and said his men weren't across the river yet. A faulty telegraph and a lost dispatch delayed the notification of the order to Reynolds. Next, Hooker thought of Daniel Sickles' 3rd Corps. One division was held back from that corps while the rest advanced in an attack on what was thought to be the retreating rebels. Fortunately for Hooker, it was his old division. It was close at hand, and he rode up to its commander and good friend Hiram Berry and said, "General, throw your men into the breach. Receive the enemy on your bayonets. Don't fire a shot. They can't see you." Despite the chaos of the evening attack on Hooker's lines, a defense was put together, and with Stonewall Jackson and his second-in-command A.P. Hill being wounded, the attacks ground to a halt in the darkness. During the night, the 1st Corps made it to the battlefield, making it unmistakable to Hooker that he outnumbered any Confederate force on the field, but he wanted to remain on the defensive. Not knowing where an attack might commence the next morning scared Hooker. On the morning of May 3rd, Hooker rode along his lines, making sure they were prepared for an assault. At 7:30 a.m., he came across a group of men standing around a prostrate body. He asked, "Who have you there, gentlemen?" When the answer came, General Berry, Hooker dismounted and bent over the dead body, saying, "My God, Berry, why was this to happen? Why was the man on whom I relied so much to be taken away in this manner?" The death of Berry greatly affected Hooker, and he became more despondent. Henry Slocum, the 12th Corps commander, informed him that the advanced line needed ammunition, both for the infantry and the artillery. Hooker simply said he couldn't make soldiers or ammunition. Despite the Confederate attacks, Hooker didn't order in the available troops from the 5th or 1st Corps to help. It seemed as if Hooker had lost his nerve and was at a loss at what to do. General Sedgwick near Fredericksburg hadn't been able to make headway, but Hooker wired him a message telling him to attack and that was an order. After that, Hooker stood on the porch of the Chancellor home. A staffer from the 3rd Corps dismounted in the yard and walked up to the porch with a message. Hooker bent over the rail to grab the message. Just then, a 12-pound solid shot from one of the Confederate artillery pieces slammed into the pillar near Hooker. It split, and part of it hit the general in the side and head. Hooker was stunned. He was taken into the house, and the rumor began to spread that Hooker was dead. After 5 minutes, Hooker got up and remounted his horse, destined for another house half a mile to the rear. As he rode, the pain became excruciating, and he was helped down, laid on a blanket, and given some brandy. He revived and got back on his horse. Luckily for him, he recovered quickly because another solid shot hit the blanket on which he was laying. At a tent near the Bullock House, Hooker made his headquarters. George Meade, the 5th Corps commander, came to Hooker and told him that the 5th and 1st Corps could still move on the enemy's left while the rest of the line held, but Hooker wouldn't take the advice. Soon he called the 2nd Corps commander, Darius Couch, to his headquarters. Hooker said, "Couch, I turn command of the army over to you. You will withdraw it and place it in the position designated on this map." Couch organized the withdrawal closer to the river, and Sedgwick, near Fredericksburg, made good headway, but more Confederates were turning to confront Sedgwick now that it looked like Hooker was firmly on the defensive. By the evening of May 4th, Hooker was back to his old self, except for some pain. That night, Hooker called his corps commanders together and asked for their opinion as to what to do next. Of the 5 corps commanders at the meeting, 3 advised something offensive, and 2 said to withdraw. Hooker believed withdrawal was the best option and ordered the army to start departing the battlefield the next day. He also ordered Sedgwick's 6th Corps to move to the north side of the Rappahannock River. Daniel Butterfield went to Washington to inform the president of the withdrawal. When he did, the president paced back and forth, saying, my God, what will the country say?" As the army was preparing to move across the river, Hooker and some of his troops were across, but a heavy rain set in, making it difficult to cross. Most of the army was on the other side of the river, leaving Couch back in command of those troops. A staff member was sent across the river to plead with Hooker to fight it out, but the orders were to withdraw as soon as possible. When the army made it back to their camps, the same ones they thought they would not occupy again, Hooker sent out a general order congratulating the men on the campaign, telling them that they had surprised the enemy, delivering heavier blows than they received, capturing 5,000 prisoners, and destroying a lot of Southern resources. Hooker's braggadocious ways returned, but the fact that he was defeated began to echo through the country. The defeat made the Northern public turn on the new commander. The General-in-Chief, Henry Halleck, visited the army personally to interview various generals about the battle. He came away with the idea that the defeat and the withdrawal was unnecessary and blamed Hooker wholeheartedly. The Committee on the Conduct of the War favored Hooker and did their best to assuage the fears of the public and the politicians about Hooker's ability, going so far as to bring commanders who participated in the battle to testify to Hooker's sobriety during the engagement. Lincoln called his cabinet together to discuss their next steps. The president was convinced to give Hooker a little more time. Lincoln commented that if Hooker had been killed by the shot which knocked over the pillar that stunned him, we should have been successful. One soldier wrote, "Uncle Joe has bit off more than he could chew, and in attempting to swallow it, has got choked." Another wrote, "Hooker stands low in the estimation of the army as the truth about Chancellorsville comes out. Sickles, Butterfield, and Hooker are the disgrace and bane of the army. They are thrice humbugs, intriguers, and demagogues." Hooker remained in command of the Army of the Potomac, but his next test would come quickly after the Battle of Chancellorsville. By June, Lee's Army of Northern Virginia was on the move, and moved so rapidly that Hooker's cavalry and the intelligence they and others brought to him claimed that Lee seemed to be everywhere at once. However, one thing was for sure: Lee was heading north. Hooker began to move the army and his headquarters north, closer to Washington, D.C., thinking that Lee was going to interpose himself between the army and the capital. Hooker's turn in fortune resulted in a significant change. Before Chancellorsville, Hooker conversed directly with the president, bypassing the general-in-chief Henry Halleck. Now, Lincoln was referring all military matters to Halleck. Hooker made suggestions for countering Lee's push northward, but Halleck countermanded every suggestion. For example, Hooker wanted to send the majority of his cavalry north to get information and blunt Lee's invasion, and use the cavalry stationed in Washington to guard the army's flanks as it pushed northward, but Halleck wouldn't allow the Washington cavalry to leave the capital. Numerous suggestions by Hooker were turned down by Halleck. Hooker's lack of information on the Confederate Army concerned him greatly, and to confuse Lee, he sent a message to all newspapers asking them not to divulge the location of any of the Federal units, to not publish any War Department reports, and to have reporters sign all their published letters. For doing this, Hooker stated, "These rules being observed, every facility possible will be given to the reporters and newspapers in this army, including the license to abuse or criticize me to their heart's content." It took until June 25th for the Army of the Potomac to move across the Potomac River, with Hooker making his headquarters at Poolesville, Maryland, on the 26th. 10,000 men were at Harper's Ferry, and Hooker wanted to use them to augment his force and to also keep them from getting captured in the indefensible area. Hooker went to Harper's Ferry on the 27th and wired Halleck saying, "I find 10,000 men here in condition to take the field. Here they are of no earthly account. They cannot defend a ford of the river, and as Harper's Ferry is concerned, there is nothing of it. All the public property could have been secured tonight, and the troops marched to somewhere they could have been of some service. Now they are but bait for the rebels should they return." General William H. French was the garrison's commander and Hooker's old West Point classmate. When Hooker ordered him to abandon Harper's Ferry, French, with permission from Hooker, wired Halleck for confirmation. The wire came back, "Pay no attention to General Hooker's orders." Angered over the humiliation, he remarked to an old friend and cavalry officer, "Halleck's dispatches severs my connection with the Army of the Potomac." At 1 o'clock, Hooker asked to be relieved. Lincoln accepted the resignation and named George Meade the commander of the Army of the Potomac. On June 28th, Meade was informed of the change, and the new commander, after protesting being made commanding general, visited Hooker. They discussed the position of the army. Then Hooker drew up General Orders No. 66. It praised Meade and asked the army to give him support. It went on to say, "Impressed with the belief that my usefulness as the commander of the Army of the Potomac is impaired, I part from it, yet not without the deepest emotion. The sorrow of parting with the comrades of so many battles is relieved by the conviction that the courage and devotion of this army will never cease nor fail." Hooker then left for the railroad at Frederick, Maryland. There he boarded a train for Baltimore, where he was to await orders at the Adjutant General's office. Joseph Hooker remained at Baltimore for days, but no orders were forthcoming. Meanwhile, the Army of the Potomac engaged in a bitter struggle with the Army of Northern Virginia at the little town of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. Frustrated, Hooker traveled to Washington, D.C. to see if he could be of any use to the War Department. Henry Halleck, the General-in-Chief, was suspicious of Hooker and ordered him arrested for entering the capital without a pass. Hooker got word to President Lincoln about the arrest, and the president must have interfered on Hooker's behalf because the general wasn't prosecuted. Lincoln didn't want to give up on Hooker. He even asked George Meade, the new commander of the army, whether he would want Hooker to be a corps commander in the Army of the Potomac. Meade took a middle road approach, but Lincoln interpreted Meade's statement as meaning he wanted Hooker to serve under him. He didn't, and told Lincoln it would be difficult for Hooker to serve under him since Hooker had been the commander of the whole army. Lincoln looked elsewhere. Missouri and Fort Monroe came up as possibilities. Hooker couldn't stand being inactive while the war continued, and he traveled to see the president regularly in order to lobby for a new appointment. He loved the Army of the Potomac, but he felt that it had early on been put in the wrong hands. He spoke about McClellan and how the army fell into evil hands, the hands of a baby who knew nothing of drill, little of organization, and nothing of its morale. It was fashioned into the congenial spirit of this man into a mass of languid inertness, destitute of either dash or cohesion. In September, a shift in the Western theater gave Hooker the chance to take command of troops again. At the Battle of Chickamauga, the Confederate Army of Tennessee defeated the Union Army of the Cumberland, with the commander of the Union Army, William S. Rosecrans, retreating to Chattanooga, Tennessee. Now that army was trapped in the city, while the Confederate Army occupied the ridges and mountains surrounding it. To relieve Rosecrans's army, the Army of the Tennessee under Ulysses S. Grant was on its way, but it wasn't clear when the army could get to Chattanooga. It was decided to dispatch 2 corps from the Army of the Potomac, the 11th and 12th, to Chattanooga, with Hooker commanding both corps. Before he left Washington, Hooker visited Abraham Lincoln. They had a good meeting, with Hooker eventually getting around to criticizing his fellow commanders, particularly the ones in the West. When Hooker stood up to leave, Lincoln allegedly told him to avoid Bourbon County, Kentucky on the way there. By the first week in October, Hooker was in Stevenson, Alabama. Rosecrans ordered him to guard the railroad from Nashville to that location in order to preserve the supply line of the Army of the Cumberland, especially since Confederate cavalry prowled Tennessee trying to cut off all the supplies going into Chattanooga. While helping to establish a solid supply line to Rosecrans, Hooker attempted to rid himself of a personal enemy in Henry Slocum. Slocum commanded the 12th Corps and had served under Hooker in the East. The personal animosity didn't go away when they were both transferred west, and Hooker suggested to the War Department that it may be wise for Slocum to be sent to Missouri. Slocum was no fan of Hooker either. They would have to remain with one another for the moment, though. The Lincoln administration believed that Rosecrans would retreat from Chattanooga, and that definitely was on Rosecrans's mind, but Old Rosie was also making preparations to open up what would become known as the Cracker Line, and nearly had the plan developed and ready to be executed. However, the War Department feared the general would retreat. They named Ulysses S. Grant to command the military division that went from the Appalachian Mountains to the Mississippi River. The victor of Fort Donelson, Shiloh, and Vicksburg heard the War Department's fears about Rosecrans, and through the consent of the department, notified Rosecrans that George Thomas, the Rock of Chickamauga, would supersede him. Grant then traveled from Louisville into Tennessee and into northern Alabama. Hooker heard about the general coming, and instead of going himself to the railroad depot to meet Grant, Hooker sent a staff officer to go pick up Grant and take him to Hooker's headquarters. When the staff officer showed up, Grant was offended that Hooker broke with military etiquette by not coming himself. He told the staffer, "If General Hooker wishes to see me, he will find me on this train." Hooker visited Grant at the train, meeting there for a while before Grant, along with Oliver Otis Howard, commander of the 11th Corps, moved on toward Chattanooga. Thomas informed Hooker of his next mission, to maneuver into Lookout Valley to secure the line of communication and supplies running from Chattanooga to Stevenson, Alabama. Hooker feared that an enemy force could sweep down from Lookout Mountain and destroy him, but Thomas wasn't deterred. The orders remained the same. Thomas also removed Slocum out from under Hooker's control, which delighted Hooker. When Hooker made it into Lookout Valley and to Brown's Ferry, part of his command was separated from the other, with a large portion near the ferry and a division at Wauhatchie. That night, Confederate forces made a night attack on those spread-out units. Through mismanagement by the Confederates, Hooker's troops were able to throw back the attacks. As more and more troops came into Chattanooga, Hooker felt his opportunity to be at the forefront slipping, especially since Grant didn't care for him. The 11th Corps was ordered to help the newly arrived William T. Sherman to try to dislodge the Confederates from Missionary Ridge, leaving Hooker with a single division, John W. Geary's division of the 12th Corps. However, this wouldn't be Hooker's fate for long. He was given command of 2 other divisions, all belonging to different armies. Charles Cruft's division of the Army of the Cumberland and Peter Osterhaus's division from the Army of the Tennessee would join Hooker. Hooker was ordered to make a demonstration against Lookout Mountain and to attack if the opportunity arose. Hooker wasn't one to back down from launching an attack if possible, so on November 24th, he prepared his divisions to attack the lofty heights of Lookout Mountain. His troops marched up the steep sides of the mountain and then began to attack the Confederates in their entrenchments and rifle pits while heavy fog clung to the side of the heights. At a plateau where a home known as the Craven's House stood, the majority of the fight took place. Once that location was captured, Hooker had his men halt and he trudged up the steep slope to inspect the fortifications. He wired back to Thomas that the position was impregnable. One of Hooker's biographers explained the significance of Hooker's actions. The positive gains of the battle were important. Navigation of the river and control of the railway to Chattanooga were assured. Much equipment was captured. The enemy's defenses across Chattanooga Valley were flanked, and the morale of the army was given a big boost. A soldier on Orchard Knob watching the advance on Lookout Mountain through an occasional break in the weather had remarked, "Look at old Hooker. Don't he fight for keeps?" The next day, Hooker attacked the Confederate left flank on Missionary Ridge and helped push the Confederate Army of Tennessee off the ridge and send them into full retreat. Hooker asked for permission from Thomas to continue the pursuit, and Thomas granted it, adding more troops to Hooker's column. Hooker chased them to Ringgold, Georgia, where Confederate Major General Patrick Cleburne was making a stand to protect the Confederate wagon train. Hooker attacked Ringgold Gap, but he faced harsher resistance than he did at Lookout Mountain. The bloody battle ended when Grant came on the scene and told Hooker to discontinue the attack. He would allow Hooker to advance as long as he didn't engage with the enemy. Hooker would say, "This puts me in the condition of the boy who was permitted to learn to swim, provided he would not go near the water." Hooker remained near Ringgold for a while before going into winter quarters at Chattanooga. His headquarters was on a hillside near the river, and his bodyguard and staff formed teams and played baseball on good weather days. Hooker, although he played the sport in his youth, didn't participate in these games. He continued to write to Washington, though, touting his own contributions to the opening of the Cracker Line and his battle above the clouds on Lookout Mountain. Grant still didn't care for Hooker, despite his good service so far under his command. Grant didn't care for his ambition because he saw it as reckless rather than an advantage. Grant soon left the Army of the Tennessee and was made commander of all Federal armies, with his headquarters in the field with the Army of the Potomac. Hooker had hoped to possibly be sent back east, especially when George Meade began to take criticism for his lack of movement following the Battle of Gettysburg, but with Grant with the army, it would never come to pass. The Army of the Cumberland around Chattanooga was reorganized, with the 11th Corps commander Oliver Otis Howard being placed in charge of the 4th Corps, and the two corps under Hooker, the 11th and 12th, being consolidated into one corps, named the 20th Corps. The spring campaign was going to be against the Army of Tennessee, but it would have a new commander, Joseph E. Johnston. Hooker had been friends with him in the old army and entered Chapultepec together during the Mexican War. He wrote that Johnston was going to be a more capable commander than Braxton Bragg. Hooker thought highly of Johnston's war record and knew that the next few months would be a struggle to wrestle Atlanta from his old friend. In early May, the Atlanta campaign began, with Hooker now formally part of the Army of the Cumberland under Thomas. Thomas liked Hooker and used him to hold the Confederates in place north of Dalton, while the Army of the Tennessee attempted to get behind the rebels and cut them off from Atlanta. Johnston pulled his army back to Resaca, and Sherman concentrated his forces there. Hooker's corps was on the Union left flank and prepared to launch an attack. Sherman, Thomas, John Schofield, the 23rd Corps commander, and Hooker all went to a bald hill to observe the Confederate position. When a rebel artillery battery began to shell the hill, Thomas and Schofield went to the rear. Sherman and Hooker remained. Neither one liked the other, and neither one wanted to show fear in the presence of the other. They mingled around, not saying a word to one another until, as one historian explained, finally, by some mysterious impulse, certainly not by any oral agreement, they simultaneously marched the rear. This schoolboy performance was quite humorous to their associates, but the bitter gulf between Sherman and Hooker made it deadly serious to them. Johnston again retreated. From Resaca, he went to Cassville, then blocked Sherman's advance to the west at New Hope Church, Dallas, and Pickett's Mill. Hooker's corps hit Johnston's line first at New Hope Church, but the Confederates wouldn't budge, so Hooker's men held the line and made demonstrations so that Thomas and James McPherson, the Army of the Tennessee's commander, made their own attacks. Johnston again retreated, this time to Kennesaw, Pine, and Lost Mountains. It was around this time that Hooker and Thomas had their only disagreement. Hooker believed that his corps was carrying the heaviest load and being stretched too thin by sending parts of it to bolster the other corps. Thomas stood his ground and said the accusations were unjustified. Hooker backed down. That was the only altercation the two men had. Hooker would declare after the war that Thomas was by far the Union's most outstanding leader. At Kennesaw Mountain, part of Hooker's corps was attacked by Confederates at Kolb's Farm. When Sherman asked him about his progress, Hooker signaled back, We have repulsed 2 heavy attacks and feel confident, our only apprehension being from our extreme right flank. 3 entire corps are in front of us." Sherman would use the message to further criticize Hooker. Sherman accused him of not following military protocol by not directing his message through Thomas, even though Sherman was the one who asked him a direct question. Sherman also thought it slanderous to say that he had apprehensions about his extreme right flank, which was guarded by Schofield. However, only Sherman seemed to be angry about the statement. Schofield was not bothered by it. Thirdly, Hooker said he had 3 corps in front of him, which was weird for him to say, as Sherman pointed out, because Johnston only had 3 corps in his whole army. Sherman didn't like the exaggeration on Hooker's part, and the rift between the two grew much deeper. Making the matter worse, Sherman went to visit Hooker and in an old church lectured him about sending false dispatches. At the brutal Battle of Kennesaw Mountain, Hooker's force had only a supporting role in the attacks. Johnston continued to retreat, this time across the Chattahoochee River. And Sherman pursued. It came to be known through the army that now Johnston had been replaced with John Bell Hood, one of his corps commanders. The next phase of the campaign would be much bloodier, with the hard-fighting Hood in charge of the army. The Army of the Cumberland came to and crossed Peachtree Creek, north of Atlanta. Along its banks on July 20th, 1864, Hood's first battle as commander of the Army of the Tennessee took place. Hooker's corps absorbed some of the deadliest attacks launched by the Confederates, but they and the rest of the army held on, throwing back the rebels. After the attack, Thomas and Sherman came to Hooker's headquarters. Hooker expressed to the 2 generals that his men were wore out and suffered heavy losses in the battle along Peachtree Creek. To that point, Hooker's corps had suffered more casualties than any of the other corps of Sherman's army group. In reference to the heavy losses, Sherman responded, "Oh, most of them will come back in a day or 2, insinuating that they simply deserted. One staff officer, hearing Sherman's words, demanded a pistol to shoot Sherman for disrespecting such brave men. 2 days after Peachtree Creek, the Battle of Atlanta erupted, but Hooker's men took no part in the battle. However, a death during the battle impacted Hooker greatly. James McPherson, the commander of the Army of the Tennessee, was killed. Temporarily, John A. Logan, the 15th Corps commander, took command, but Sherman needed a permanent successor. Sherman decided against choosing Logan, somewhat based on him not having a military education. Hooker was the highest-ranking corps commander in either of the 3 armies in Sherman's army group and expected to be placed as that army's commander. When Sherman chose Oliver Otis Howard, that was the last straw for Hooker, who couldn't take any more of Sherman's insults. He wrote out a resignation letter to Thomas saying, "I have just learned that Major General Howard, my junior, has been assigned to the command of the Army of the Tennessee. If this is the case, I request that I may be relieved from duty with this army. Justice and self-respect alike require my removal from an army in which rank and service are ignored." Hooker reached out to Logan and told him that had Logan remained in command of the army, he himself would have stayed with the Army of the Cumberland. But when a general from another army was placed in command of the Army of the Tennessee, he couldn't bear the injustice. Perhaps he hoped that Logan may resign in protest with him, but Logan's future political aspirations wouldn't let him leave the army. Hooker left the army, and his men hated to see him go. After coming west, Hooker demonstrated his ability as a commander, but his mouth got in his own way. A member of his corps wrote, "What the 20th Corps has accomplished under Hooker's command and how much the success of the campaign is due to him, the public will never learn from Western correspondence or official dispatches. No general was more careful of the comfort and welfare of his men. When other corps were hungry, we always had rations. When other corps were ragged, we had clothes." He waited for 2 months for a command to come available. He visited Niagara Falls and visited family in Watertown. He delivered a speech saying, "This Union, gentlemen, cannot be dissolved as long as the army have guns to fight with. I believe in treating the rebellion as General Jackson treated Indians. Whip them first and treat with them afterwards." On September 28, 1864, he was given command of the Northern Department, encompassing Michigan, Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois. He was responsible for taking care of prisoners in the prisoner of war camps located in those states, to guard the northern border from arms and ammunition coming south, and enforce the draft. Hooker got all kinds of reports but referred to most of it as stuff or of little credence. His biggest problem was with guerrillas raiding across the Ohio River, but he bolstered the units in those areas to deal with the irregulars. Hooker also moved the department headquarters from Columbus, Ohio to Cincinnati, Ohio, a better location for dealing with the duties of the department. However, there was another reason Hooker moved his headquarters. Miss Olivia Grosbeck lived there. At age 50, Hooker took up a serious courtship with the young woman, 11 years his junior. When reports about possible sabotage missions coming from Canada found their way to Hooker's desk, he put little faith in the reports, although he did make a statement. If anything of this sort is attempted, I intend that somebody shall be hurt before it is over, if I have to go into Canada to do it. If the Canadian authorities allow our enemies to enter the territory to organize for hostile purposes, I shall exercise the same right, and if exception is taken, it can be arranged afterward by negotiation. When Hooker heard about the advancement of Sherman, Philip Sheridan, and Meade to major generals in the regular army, Hooker responded, "Would it not be far better to put military commissions in the market and dispose of them at public auction as any other commodity?" He then accused Sherman of having no more judgment than a child. A studied effort has been made by Generals Grant and Sherman to keep me in the background. It would have given me the greatest satisfaction to have broken my saber over the head of Sherman. When Lincoln won election in the fall of 1864, Hooker stated that it was the greatest victory of the war, and attended the inaugural ball in March 1865. After that, he remained in Washington and testified before the Committee on the Conduct of the War. At its conclusion, and in its report, it declared that Hooker was blameless for the defeat at Chancellorsville. Hooker had been fighting for this for a long time, and now he had it in writing that he wasn't to blame for the defeat. A little over a month into Lincoln's second term, he was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth. Lincoln had been a staunch supporter of Hooker, so the general took the president's death hard. Since he was to be laid to rest in Springfield, Illinois, it was in his department, and he escorted the body from when it entered the department until it reached Springfield. There he took part in the funeral procession, and at the grave he sat stiff in his saddle as the preacher spoke over the body of the slain president. At the end of May, Hooker returned to California to accept the sword that the legislature of the state commissioned for him over 2 years before. With over 400 diamonds, various inscriptions, and gold throughout, it was a stunning sword. At the end of June, Hooker presided over a meeting where 10,000 people came to hear Grant speak. Hooker and Grant's first time speaking since Chattanooga was uneventful. In July, he went east to take command of the Department of the East, encompassing New England, New York, and New Jersey, which was within the military division of the Atlantic, commanded by George Meade. In September, he returned to Cincinnati, and in October, he and Olivia were married. The next month, at a reception for General Grant in New York City, Hooker suffered a stroke, losing nearly all use of his right side. Nevertheless, he stayed with his command, and by the summer of 1866, he had nearly completely recovered. But Olivia began to suffer illness. He was transferred to the Department of the Great Lakes, with his headquarters in Detroit, Michigan. In early 1867, he suffered another stroke and had to take leave of absence. He and Olivia traveled to Europe, hoping both of them could recover there. They returned in July 1868, and shortly thereafter, Olivia passed away. 3 months later, Hooker retired from the Army. Hooker spent his retirement years attending the reunions of the various groups he was affiliated with, like the Grand Army of the Republic, the Army of the Cumberland, and the Army of the Potomac. He continued to insult Grant, Sherman, and Howard in speeches and letters. One of the only men to get his praise was Thomas. He preached reconciliation after the war and welcomed Southerners into his home, including the hard-fighting Confederate General John B. Gordon. He commissioned a huge painting of himself at the Battle of Lookout Mountain, and it was put on exhibition in a New York gallery in 1874. Although physically handicapped, Hooker traveled across the country to California. He wanted to see his old property again. When he arrived, various groups came together to throw him a huge reception. He made it back home in time to cast his ballot in the presidential election of 1872 against Grant and for Horace Greeley. Hooker even predicted that Grant would suffer a great defeat, but he was wrong. Although Hooker linked up with the radical Republicans in the Committee on the Conduct of the War, he soon went back to his old political party, saying, "I never was anything else than a Democrat." On October 31st, 1879, Hooker wrote a letter about a statue of George Thomas to be erected in Washington, D.C. It said, I assure you it is the only equestrian statue in Washington that will be likely to receive the admiration of all who gaze upon it, and in my judgment the representative of the most gifted soldier this country ever produced, and the best man in all respects it has ever been my fortune to know." At the conclusion of this letter, Hooker passed away at his home in Garden City, New York, the body laid in state in the City Hall in New York City, with a massive crowd to come see the general. The pallbearers, which included Generals Daniel Butterfield, Winfield Scott Hancock, and Abner Doubleday, escorted the body to a special train destined for Cincinnati. Once there, the body was taken to Spring Grove Cemetery to be laid next to his wife. On the journey to the cemetery, old soldiers followed, accompanied by a riderless horse, and veterans carrying torn and tattered battle flags. At sundown, he was laid to rest. Abraham Lincoln pointed out the biggest downfall of Joseph Hooker when he composed a letter explaining his reasons for placing Hooker as the commander of the Army of the Potomac. Hooker criticized his superiors to anyone who would lend him an ear. This backbiting that Lincoln identified kept Hooker on the bad side of many influential commanders like Sherman and Grant later in the war. Hooker also made friends with influential politicians, which helped his star rise in the Union Army. Despite his bad qualities of openly criticizing superiors and other generals, Hooker was a capable division and corps commander. His men loved him, and he performed good service on the Peninsula and at Second Manassas. At Antietam, his brigades went in piecemeal, but he wasn't present during the entire engagement, being wounded in the foot. At Fredericksburg, his command was dismantled, being sent to other commanders for their use, so his performance there was lackluster at no fault of his own. When he finally took command of the Army of the Potomac, Hooker finally reached what he had been searching for, but the Battle of Chancellorsville demonstrated some holes in his confident armor. He wasn't as confident when it was him alone who commanded the army, and didn't have anyone else to blame. When Robert E. Lee invaded Pennsylvania, Hooker had trouble getting correct information on the enemy, and with what information he did have, he attempted to halt the advance as much as possible, but his suggestions to the General-in-Chief, Henry Halleck, were countermanded and subverted. This led him to resign as the Army commander. When Hooker went west, his performance was commendable. He captured Lookout Mountain and helped dislodge the Confederates from Missionary Ridge. The Battle of Wauhatchie could have been a disaster for Hooker because of the spread-out nature of his force, and his men succeeded in throwing back the rebels, but Hooker didn't play a significant role in their success. At Ringgold Gap, Hooker suffered his worst defeat since Chancellorsville, and his tactical ability in that battle was suspect. Perhaps he thought he could dislodge the rebels like he and the others did at Missionary Ridge. What he didn't know was that he faced one of the most capable commanders in any Confederate army, Patrick Cleburne. On the Atlanta campaign, Hooker worked incredibly hard to keep his men supplied and ready for combat, and his casualties bear out that the Corps was one of the hardest fighting, if not the hardest fighting corps in all of Sherman's army group. For a man whose life was at the forefront of newspapers and in the public mind, it's strange when one reads about his later life and learns how muted those years were. The strokes he suffered limited his ability somewhat, even though he strove to regain his full capabilities. Although at reunions and to others he still criticized certain commanders of the war, he never received the same post-war attention that others received for their rhetoric and publishings. Joseph Hooker will go down in history as a man with uncontrolled ambition, and that led him to criticize the wrong people. He will be known as the man who, when confronted by an enemy that he boasted he would best, recoiled at some of the least bit of resistance. This lack of confidence manifested itself at Chancellorsville, but didn't seem to appear in other areas of the war. He remained confident elsewhere in any other campaign. Hooker will also go down in history, wrongly so, for being the reason that prostitutes are called hookers. That name was in existence before Hooker himself rose to prominence, but it may be said that the name Hooker was reinforced by the camp followers around his units, whether divisions, corps, or Army of the Potomac. That, unfortunately, may be his longest-lasting legacy, even though it was a myth. Hooker put on an outward appearance of confidence, which he displayed to the world, but the Battle of Chancellorsville unveiled to himself and the world that the confidence he displayed was a mask. He wasn't always confident in his abilities, despite all of his boasts. If you like what I do, please consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't done so already, join the Patreon page, and purchase something from one of my online stores. Every little bit helps. Thank you.